Thanks everyone for being here on the last day, right at the end. We're almost there. I'm here today to talk a little bit about the role of risk in trust in maps. I'm completing my master's work right now, and this is a part of the research I've done for this. Let's start off thinking about ourselves here. So some of you last night I saw were out on the street hanging out, and you're out in a new city trying to get back after a night out. What route do you take, and how do you trust your phone to get home? Can I get a show of hands? Who's walking down this alley when they get there at 1 a.m.? We got anyone? No takers? How about this one? Maybe? Okay. Well, it's kind of easy to tell when you're there, but ideally you're not at the end of the alley when you find out if you're walking down it or not. So let's look at a couple examples from Louisville here. This is something you might see. This is a little alley. How people feeling? You see that on your phone on the way home? Maybe. How about this one? We're a little bit more built up. We got a parking lot next to us. Maybe a little less attractive. So this is all to show we have different conceptions of risk as individuals here. And a lot of map trust research has not attempted to capture the individual differences that affect our willingness to take action based on information from a map. So for this part of my thesis, I'm really focusing on, do differences in risk cause differences in trust in a map? Right? We have seen tons of great maps these past couple days, and some of them, whether you trust that information or not, really has no effect on your life. And then we saw like just a FEMA flood map. Whether you trust that or not has a much bigger effect on where you live, what you're doing, maybe where you're putting your apartment. So to talk about this, we definitely need to talk a little bit about definitions. So trust here, we're really talking about the feelings and the action that you experience when you read a map. So these are based on what you're seeing, right? But they're also based on your whole life experience. So we all see the same object, it's all there, but we do not all have the exact same impression. We have great best practices to try to make those impressions on average the same, but that does not mean they are all the same. So your trust is really in the object, person, institution, as opposed to trustworthiness comes up here too. It's really a property of the object. Now, if you see this, we can figure out trustworthiness based on trust, but we get into a little circle of I trust things that are trustworthy and things that I trust are trustworthy. It can be tough to differentiate out then what factors actually lead us to that, as opposed to our feelings being applied to the factors afterwards. To do this, we've talked a little, the field has really talked a lot about antecedents of trust, which are these properties of the object that may inspire or erode trust, right? So this could be something like seeing a typo on a slide or on a map. Might make you feel, maybe this isn't a professional product. May I trust this a little bit less? The typo itself there would be an antecedent to the feeling you experience. Here, we've adapted a framework from visualization trust research and expanded it for cartography in a publication for ICA this year. So when we're talking about risk in particular, we're really talking about a type of experiential piece to this, right? It's not in the object itself, but it's going to be a view. And we're also talking about both cognitive and affective trust. Cognitive is decisions you consciously make based on what you're seeing, like a typo may make you think that way, whereas affective, we know, are much more things that you're not consciously processing. Maybe it's a color palette that you don't like or think is extreme, or all these other best practices we have to make things stand out or go away there. But risk is really going to encapsulate both of these, right? We have the risk, part of this is going to be decisions we make intentionally, and part of this is going to be about how we feel about what we're seeing when we see it. So risk, yeah, let's talk about it a little bit. It's really kind of a combination of, it's an outcome of both your tolerance and your perception here. So there's a part where we fundamentally don't perceive the same risk from the same activity, and that's based on your whole life, and I can't replicate that. And there's a part of it that has to do with your tolerance. And your tolerance might be based on the kind of cost-benefit analysis there of, hey, I think this is worth it, I don't think it's worth it. You could have a different tolerance than someone else, and depending on what you want to do, you'll do that. And yeah, and here tolerance is really related to your understanding, and perception is related to your understanding of what you're seeing. So to talk a little about the experimental design, for my experiment, participants were given a scenario in which they were asked to enact and evaluate some maps. The scenarios described 3 different levels of risk. Each person, importantly, only saw one level of risk. So the risk level was held constant across each individual, but varied across the whole group. To do this, each person was then shown 4 maps. These maps were designed to be intentionally similar, but different enough that you weren't looking at the same map every time. And you were asked to allocate resources based on a map. This is a way to get people involved. There's been some good studies showing that experimental scenario-based design can really help encourage people to interact more fully with the map. This is a little problematic because we don't always interact fully with maps. Right? There's lots of maps we look at very briefly and move on with our lives. So this is a little bit of a limitation of the approach. But where we are with trust research at this point, we really need to get kind of something on the experimental side before we can get picky about what it's going to be and how best to do it. Also importantly, they were asked to retrieve the value of the phenomenon at a point. This was just to check if they were understanding the map and able to retrieve information accurately. And they were asked to rate the map on the map trust scale that Tim Pretzby created to try to measure trust. That scale, well, we'll get to it. Study phenomenon. This is a tricky thing to pick for trust. So what I chose in the end was a map of ultrasound. And ultrasound here we're talking about just frequencies that are higher than we can hear. They exist around us all the time, but we are not able to perceive them as people. And this was intentionally chosen because they are invisible. Most people have very little prior knowledge, so there's less bias there. And it's plausibly harmful. When I tell you it's harmful, you could believe it's harmful. And when I tell you it's not, you could believe it's not. And we were able to use fictional ultrasound data for this. It took a couple more steps to get this all approved, but we were able to use a little bit of deception and use fictional data. And of course, participants then were informed at the end. So like I said, each participant was given their scenario and they were evaluated. They each only received one level of risk here. I'm going to show you what one of the scenarios is. This is a big piece of text. Importantly, the last line is what's changing each time. So we particularly recruited people that were interested in dogs. Because we do know dogs can hear ultrasound. It's plausibly harmful to your pet. And reasonably, you'd care about your pet's health. So I will say that the white text is kind of accurate. The real understanding is not very good. It's clear that dogs can hear ultrasound. And it's clear that it's uncomfortable when it's loud, just like for us. But that's really all the established research knows about it. And we were able to alter this final line, as well as include a fake citation to manipulate the level of risk there. So our final lines for the three scenarios, one simply says there is no evidence that it's harmful. Try to establish that there's no real risk as we go on. We had a low one, which is just saying, it might be harmful and maybe not great, as opposed to then the high risk scenario, which we read earlier, that it's pretty detrimental. So folks read this and then went into their tasks. of grading these maps and if they effectively trust them or not. We were able to get a good number of responses. I got 265 complete responses. And this was all done for free. I just sent it to the university email list. And I'll say, I think a lot of this has to do with the dog in the title. I got some pretty good response rate. So just if you can pick whatever you want, pick something that people are going to do. So yeah, actually taking a look at the data. Map trust, if you're not familiar with the scale, you're asked to rate 12 different adjectives and how it applies to the map. It's typically a Likert scale 1 to 7. So that's what we're getting out, values 1 to 7. Because of that, a lot of people, it's not really normally distributed, right? A lot of people often pick high. I think there's very little thought for the average person about distrusting maps. And so in general, we definitely see stuff skewed to the right. Now, importantly, on the risk question here, this is what I got. Now, you'll see they are very similar. And in fact, when we go on to do some statistical tests, there is no significant difference between these levels. Really, people did not seem to change the rating of any of their adjectives when they experienced different risks. Like you see, actually, no and low have a extremely similar number, where we got to we saw very little difference there. To try to parse this out more, I looked a little bit at each individual adjective to see if there's any skew there. And this is a quick histogram. It's a stack of histograms where each adjective is a different color on there. And the red lines show the average rating for each adjective. And you'll see again, we really saw stuff that's very similar across the board. People rank things in a similar way. There didn't seem to be big differences or one adjective that stood out as more problematic or more interpretive than another. So the question of this is really, what does it mean? It seems intuitive that risk would have something to do with map trust, but we don't see that. So that's kind of our first option here, is that this was all good and risk has no effect. It also is, clearly in the map trust, risk is not an adjective. There's nothing that really gets at risk, and that has succeeded. This is kind of scary if it's true, right? We kind of want people to care more when things are really important, but it doesn't seem like they're trying to interrogate more or look for sources more or anything that might cause them to trust less. But that's what our numbers support at this point. The other option here is that my risks were just not calibrated, right? This scenario wasn't rounded out well enough. Maybe the risks themselves weren't large enough to see a difference. Our high risk, it was, in my opinion, pretty high risk compared to no risk, but maybe it wasn't big enough. Also, the scenarios, we were talking about risks to dog health. These weren't things that were likely to impact the person themselves. Now, they do care about their pets, so I again, don't know about that. And then again, there was no actual consequences for these individuals. These were neighborhoods that they didn't know about. They were made up, right? But they were not like your neighborhood, and you don't see yourself in this data, so maybe that's a big piece of it. So that is kind of where I land on this, is that we really need a better scenario to see impact of risk. Like I said, this all ends up with there being no measured risk. And it may be that it's on me and my scenario based in the design, or it may be that we cannot find an effect of risk on trust. As far as, for me, future steps, I think finding a scenario that is kind of tailored, that we can really see a difference among people is really important. It's one of the hardest parts of this, is picking something that some people would see as a problem and some people wouldn't, and some people would trust and some people wouldn't. So that might be the long term here, is workshopping some kind of perfect scenario and map design there. With that, say thank you, and I'll take any questions if there are any.
All right. Hi, where are the maps that you used to evaluate the risk levels?
Oh, great question. Here are the maps I used. This is a set of processes. This is like one question in my master's. I have some of the other questions are about how the data is actually represented. So there are 4 different representations. Now again, for each person, you're looking at across all 4 representations, and they're all in the same risk level. So you're still seeing stuff. You'll see these are actually the same data plotted 4 different ways. Right? We tell people that it starts as that these are collected at 80% of intersections at a point source, which you see on the far side. We see a contoured extrapolation there in the middle, a polygonized one, and then finally a rasterized one. Like I said, we couldn't show everyone the same map. So what we actually did is there's a set of, there's 4 data sets that are statistically similar. We tested for similarity just as data themselves, as well as checking for clustering with some spatial autocorrelation checks. So this would be the potential suite you see. You're really looking at 4 different data sets that are as similar as we could make them. But you're still not looking at the same data every time to try to prompt you to really think about this anew and not just say, yeah, I saw that before, we're good.
So one of the things I wonder about, this raises the question, is whether there's a difference in trust in this object, which is a third-person thing created by someone else, when a lot of sort of the baseline of what trust is based on interpersonal relationships. You know, I trust this person. That is the root of human trust behavior. And whether there's a difference between trusting information that's given to you by a person, how that relates to, you know, I trust you and you trust them, so I trust them, those kinds of creating networks of trust. I'm not sure how you test that, but it's interesting that the object-based trust seems not to have that kind of personal sense of risk. I'm just wondering, thinking about how to do risk that is not just about what'll happen to me, but is also about betrayal. I mean, one of the things about risk is that you trust someone and then they betray you. How to bring that sense into things.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question. But that is kind of a more classic economic way to look at some of this, right? But the nice thing about an economic game is you can have these multiple rounds. It's really tough to think of a way to have maps with multiple rounds of like, well, that map wasn't right, and you made the wrong decision, and now let's try again. There's probably a way to do that, and it is interesting. There is some old trust research it's on institutional trust, but really looking at I think it's the French steel industry, and how a lot of people talk about these competing companies. You don't trust your competitors, but at the same time, when they talked in person with the individuals, they trust their individuals. So even though you're at a rival company, we don't trust that company. I trust you, and I think there is something there. I'd love to get at it, but it'll take a little more thinking before I can get there.
Any others? All right, Alton, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.